There we go. Okay. So this week, what you have are a couple of Edpuzzle videos. So I think that these are super helpful videos because what it does is it not only walks you through like a think aloud writing exercise, but then it also goes through a grading process. So he'll go through and grade 3 essays, one's a 10, one's a 6, and one's a 2. So you can see what a really good essay looks like and sounds like, what a decent essay looks like, and what like a really bad essay looks like. So you can get kind of an idea. What I want you to, and obviously those are all in Edpuzzle, so they're easy to do, but I really want you to focus in and pay attention on what he's talking about because he has some really, really good suggestions on how you can write a really good DBQ in 45 minutes. Because I think that that's been the overwhelming anxiety that most of you have had is, how on earth am I going to get this done in 45 minutes? And I think the key is that you have a graphic organizer that you like. So at the end of the DBQ that you're doing this week on the Civil War, I have a graphic organizer on there. If you want to, after watching those Edpuzzle videos, you're like, oh, dang, like that graphic organizer is so much better than Miss Hall's, please use that one instead. It is not going to hurt my feelings. It doesn't matter one bit. You need to find one that's good for you because that is really the only way that you're going to be able to get this done in 45 minutes. So you're going to need to be able to settle in, figure out what that question is asking, and do a quick run through of those documents, and then get started. If you have a graphic organizer that works, the sign that it works is after you fill it out, does the essay then write itself? If it does, then that's a really good graphic organizer. If not, and there's lots of other things left to do, then it's not going to work for you. And doing some of you, when you do your graphic organizers for me, are so detailed, and it's like the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, but you're not going to be able to do that the day of the AP exam. So what I really like about the video is where he walks through and does his think aloud as he fills out the graphic organizer, and he shows you shorthand what he would write to get to that same point so that he knows what he's talking about when he goes to put it into full sentences. The other thing I want you to make sure that because after watching the videos, what I want you to remember about the grading one is that the 10 that he's grading was written by a teacher. And that's really important for you to understand because I think some of you might watch that video and say, holy crap, like I can't possibly write an essay like that. That's too complex. That vocabulary is so much more elevated than mine. Well, duh, it was written by a teacher. So take a deep breath and remember that, and he's going to talk about this in his video, but there are some points on the rubric that whether it's super eloquent, complex, and sophisticated, or it's basic, they get the same score. So I want you to take the bits that are helpful to you. I want you to see what a really good essay looks like. And then after that, you can say, here's what I know how to do really well. Here's the tips that I can take from this essay, and then I can maximize the amount of points that I get. So please don't be disheartened by that, that 10 score essay, because I don't expect you to write that essay in 2 weeks. I expect you to write something between what you wrote for me in your last DBQ and then what is in that essay. And so you'll see some differences. He's going to recommend that you don't do Pepper. Don't eat that rock. Pepper. Pepper had to have surgery this week because she ate something that she shouldn't have. So now she has the cone of shame. Shame. So anyways, what I want you to be thinking about is that, especially that outside knowledge point, we've been practicing to put it in a separate paragraph, and you still can. The important thing is like how then you connect it back to your argument. But he's going to suggest that you put it into the body paragraphs, which is fine. I think that he has some great insight and some great tips in ways that you can still get that outside knowledge point and make it different from your sourcing, which is the analysis of the document. So watch those videos, take what you want from it. If you can improve on one component of your essay as a result of those videos, then I think that the goal is met. But that's the point of those essays. What I want to also draw your attention to, and I'm going to share my screen here for a second. Let me pull up this document that I posted on your on Google Classroom. Here we go. Okay. Here we go. So I posted this for you on Google Classroom. This walks you through the expectations about the AP exam and how you can know that you're prepared. And so the document that the College Board released to teachers is 51 pages. And they also sent it to you, but I imagine that once you saw how long it was, you didn't even pay attention. And that's fair. But I took 51 pages and I pared it down to 1 page, or else I like borrowed most of this from another teacher and then I added some stuff. But here is the full document here. You shouldn't care about that. But if you really want to read all 51 pages, by all means. Here's the video walkthrough. It's posted on Google Classroom also, but there's a link here. But what's really important is that next week they're going to start to do some of these demo sessions where you're going to be able to practice logging into the platform that you're going to be using, checking in, getting the prompts, seeing what the platform looks like. So you are really comfortable with what you're going to be seeing in 2 weeks. I need you to, at some point next week, do the demo. Because if you can't access that demo platform, you will not be able to access the AP exam. So you need to, at some point next week, and I put that link also on Google Classroom, you need to use this link and go and test out that demo page. You're going to be given a practice ticket, so you can put that in, so on and so forth. You're also going to be getting, on the 13th of May, your e-ticket. They will send this to you via email. They might also text it to you if you followed my instructions to put your cell phone number in there also. And so they will send you this information, your ticket to get into the AP exam. If you don't get that email, don't freak out. It is also on your College Board account. And so you just have to follow that link and then you can go and access your individual ticket, and you need to make sure that you have that. You don't share your code with anybody. It is just for you to access your AP exam. So make sure that you have that, especially if you're somebody that gets like extended time or something like that, that's programmed into yours only. So you need to make sure that you're accessing yours alone. Here's the big thing, and some of us in my group talked about this last week because a couple students said that they write a whole lot faster than they type. So here's going to be my recommendation to you. If you are going to be typing your essay, then what you're going to do is use one of these platforms, preferably Chrome, and you're going to have, I suggest you split your screen. So you're going to have like a Google Doc open or a Microsoft Word document open, half screen on this side, and then your AP exam on the other side with all of your documents and stuff like that so that you can be writing side by side. You can even have a soft copy of your graphic organizer if you want to. You can have that out. If you do it on your computer, it's going to be really easy because you're going to be able to type up your document and then easily upload to the platform because you're already using the platform. If you are going to be doing your AP exam in handwritten form, the problem you're going to have is uploading your photographs of your document, and so, or your PDF files, whatever you're going to use. Because what's going to happen is if I have it open on my computer, but I'm handwriting it, then what I'm going to have to do is take a picture of it with my phone or a PDF file. I'm going to have to email it to myself or upload to my Google Docs. And then I'm going to have to, or from my Google Drive, I'm going to have to then go from my Google Drive to the platform to upload it there. And that's like 3 or 4 steps. And in that span of time, who knows how long that's going to take. And so let's say suddenly my internet glitches in the process of emailing that document to myself. Well, now, you know, you have that timer running down. And if that timer runs out, it's going to be in red in the corner of your screen. If that timer runs out and you're still uploading your document, it will not take it. And it would be really sad if you wrote that whole DBQ and then just because of uploading purposes, you didn't get it done in time. So if you're going to handwrite it, I really recommend that you just have the essay open on your phone and the documents on your phone, because then you're already open on the platform. You're not going to be able to log into multiple places. So I won't be able to log in on my computer and also log in on my phone. So if you're going to handwrite your essay, open the platform on your phone, read the documents from your phone, write it by hand, take a picture of it, and then you're already on that platform, and then you can automatically upload and post. And so that's just my little suggestion to you if you're going to be doing that. And so make sure you're using one of these supported platforms. If you're using a Mac, you can use Notes, so that's good. And then you probably will need to convert it to a .doc though. So just make sure that when if you're in a Mac and you're using Pages or whatever, that you're exporting it as a PDF file or as a .doc. And then it has on here, you should log in 30 minutes prior to the exam. We talked about that last week. Same thing as if you were doing it face-to-face, you're there a half hour ahead of time. So make sure that that's going to be what you're doing. Make sure that everybody in your house that doesn't need to be using the internet at that time, make sure they log off just so that your bandwidth is secure. And then manage your time. Your timer is going to be on your screen. It'll turn red when you have 5 minutes left to upload. And then, here's information about how you can upload your document from your desktop. And so if you're going to be using Google Docs, you're going to need to download it to your device and then upload it from there. So just make sure you download it as a .doc or a PDF file. So review this. We just reviewed it together, but I wouldn't hurt for you to go back over that again and just make sure that you have all of that straight before you go to the AP exam or before, that date comes around. And so, yes, so Mr. Borges has a number of tips on here. Yes, Pepper looks like Leica. That's true. We might send her off to space if she eats something else at our house. And so, yeah, use your graphic organizer as much as possible so that'll save you some time at the end of the day. I'm going to move out of the sun because I'm going to get a major sunburn. So what are your questions about the exam before we move into content? And you can unmute yourself if you'd like to.
Mrs. Hall, look at Audrey's post there.
Oh, good question. So you don't need it. You're right. You don't need to delete it. I did make an optional assignment this week for you to do a progress check, or not progress check, sorry, a practice exam. And that does require your lockdown browser. If you would like to delete it because you're not going to do that optional assignment, and it's not worth any points. So just kind of before some of you got really excited. But if you're going to do that practice test, then you will need it. But if you don't intend to do that practice test, then you do not need the lockdown browser. So you can delete it if you feel like it's taking some of your bandwidth or some of your, making your computer work slower.
Okay, I guess I was just concerned that like I would go into the test and then it would open up that browser and I wouldn't be able to type or anything, but it's not going to do that? No,
because when I assign you a practice test or anything like that that is secure, it is an option on that assignment to slide it, and so it is not going to be the case. It won't tap into that on your computer while you're doing the AP exam.
Okay. Awesome.
They're only doing the lockdown browser for multiple choice questions because they don't want those to get out. These free response questions are less persnickety about because there's so many different answers to that question.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Miss Hall?
Yeah.
I had a question concerning the format of the document that it needs to be in. Mm-hmm. So I know like for APUSH I would just like type it, but for like other classes, if we like have to write it, so we couldn't just like take a picture of our assignment or anything like that. Like how would that work?
So they have to allow you to handwrite it if you want to. Okay. And so because some people, it becomes then a race about like if you are a fast typer, you're automatically going to do better because you're just going to get more down on paper. And so they can't, and for the fact that we have been preparing you to handwrite this essay, so you haven't been practicing writing a timed essay on your computer. And so they can't use that against you. If you don't want to type it, you are allowed to handwrite it. So they will have the ability for you to click upload and like I said, if you're going to handwrite it, you absolutely need to start the exam on your phone because then you can click upload and then you can select take a picture and then you can just snap a picture of it.
Okay, so you can have the format as like a picture and then upload it, right? It doesn't have to be like converted to PDF or anything like that.
I don't think so, no, because they did not say anything about that. In terms of a document, what I might suggest that you do, and again, I didn't see this, they didn't say anything about that on the video, but there's a program called Genius Scan that's free, and you can take a picture, you can open that program up, take a picture of something, and then it converts it into a PDF file, and then you can send it to yourself. So that's an option, but I believe that because you can take the exam on your phone, you should be able to take a photograph of your essay.
Okay, perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And if Mr. Bordas can use Genius Scan, then anybody can.
Do we get points off for typos?
No, that is absolutely still the case. I mean, even on the written AP exam, grammar doesn't count, spelling doesn't count. As long as they know what you're trying to say, it will not count against you. So do not be concerned. All right. If you guys have any continued questions about the exam, you can type it in, or you can unmute yourself and interrupt me. I really don't mind, or Mr. Bordas, as we start to talk about some of our stuff. So I posted, or on, yeah, Luke does make a good point. You need to make sure that you're with good lighting when you take a picture with Genius Scan. Make sure that there aren't shadows, because if it interprets a shadow as like coloring, and so it'll black parts of it out. So yeah, just make sure you're with good lighting for that. And so I have a couple of different things that I posted. Let me share my screen with you. There we go. Oh, nope. There we go. Okay. So I have this PowerPoint that my group, we worked off of last week, and is available to you on Google Drive. And then there's also this one here. And this is a PowerPoint that I have for you in your review folder, and it's just called the Presidents. And so this is just, it goes through every single president, and it just gives one slide of information about them. And so if you wanted to review like the forgotten presidents, like here we start to get into Fillmore, Pierce, you know, Polk is not forgettable, but some of these guys in here, you can, before Lincoln, and then getting into the Gilded Age, forgotten presidents after Reconstruction, you can start to look through some of these guys here. But it also has like little things on there that are happening during their presidency. And this might be a good thing for you when you're reviewing by unit. Most of you had things like this already in your timeline that you talked about, but this is just a good resource for you to have if it's something that you would like to use. Obviously, when we start our time period today, we are not starting with any president yet because we haven't gotten there yet. And so I'm just going to go through, Mr. Bordas and I are going to go through some stuff related to the time period. Remember, we're doing 2 time periods today. We're going to try to get to as much as we can. What's really important to think about in terms of the DBQ, usually what they're going to ask you, obviously for a specific historical thinking skill, but usually it's going to be something about like a response. Like talk about the government's response to something, the changes in the government's response, the changes in political opinion, or the changes in popular opinion related to something, the changes in, talk about how people are interacting with each other over a particular issue. And so as you study, don't try to just memorize things in isolation. You're really not going to get a lot of bang for your buck with that. What you should be talking about is, okay, this one big event happened. Okay, cool. But like, how does that affect what other people are doing? How does that affect what other people are thinking? How does that affect how other people are living their lives? That's what the kind of stuff they're going to want you to talk about. And so that I want, and that'll help you remember things a lot better, because then it'll make the timeline kind of fall into place. Because usually when a big event happens, it doesn't just happen and then nothing happens until the next big event. Everything is connected. The sentiments, there's never a completely satisfied population with anything. So people are always going to be dissatisfied with the decisions of government, with the decisions of the majority, with the decisions of whatever it might be. And that starts a chain reaction of events that lead to the next big event. And so, you know, thinking about that, that's a great way to think about history. Everything is connected. Everything is a response to something else. So let's talk about some contextualization. So when we're getting to this time period starts in 1754, why does the College Board start this in 1754?
That's the beginning of the French and Indian War, right?
It is the beginning of the French and Indian War. And why does the College Board consider that to be a turning point? We call that periodization. So like this is a moment in history where people are affected in such a way that it changes the way that they live. So what about the French and Indian War qualifies as a turning point here?
It changes the way that the British run the colonies.
Absolutely, yes, because before, what did the colonies enjoy?
Solitary neglect, and they can just
Yeah.
like virtual representation and stuff.
Exactly. Well, they didn't enjoy virtual representation.
They didn't enjoy that, but
no. But certainly they lived largely without significant oversight, right? So they got to, and we talked last week, my group did anyway, about how the colonies are getting to experiment in all of these kind of democratic institutions, right? They're creating the House of Burgesses, they're creating all of these different examples of democratic societies without really having the blessing of the British to do it, but the British don't really care that they're doing it because they're like, there's really no authoritative power that your government has in terms of what we do. They were allowed to smuggle. They kind of did mostly what they wanted to. And the French and Indian War is going to change that. The British are going to take a much more firm oversight position on the colonies. What about the French and Indian War makes that change happen?
The British gained a lot of
debts in the war.
Say that again?
The large amount of debts gained from the war for the for the colonies.
Yes, absolutely. We have tons of debt. War is very expensive. What else causes a change in oversight?
The British gain a lot of territory from the French, but they don't really want the Americans to go there.
Yes. So we have a problem still, because in the French and Indian War, it's not the French versus the Indians, it's the French and the Indians versus the British and the Indians, right? So the idea that Native people lose no matter who wins, and they are not going to be satisfied. Those that were on the French side are not just going to be satisfied by saying, oh, darn, we lost, let's just go push ourselves back. They are going to continue to resist encroachment on their land. And that is a problem because we can't have colonists going and squatting on that land and constantly having to be defended because they're subjects of the British Crown. So they need to be defended by the military. The military, we can't afford to keep sending them into the backcountry. And so the Proclamation of 1763 is going to basically negate one of the reasons the colonists fought with the British in the first place, right? There are only two really significant things that the colonists foresee as advantageous for them to get involved in this war. Besides land, what is the other thing that they want? What kind of economic system are they living under at this point?
Mercantilism?
Yes. What is the goal of mercantilism?
To use the colonies to benefit the colonizing country.
Yes, because those colonizing countries want to be what?
They want to maximize their exports and minimize their imports.
Yes, they want to be as self-sufficient as possible, right? So they're going to colonize all these lands so that they can get as much as they can, so that they don't have to trade with other places, that they can have everything that they need within their colonies. And so again, maximizing exports, minimizing imports. That's kind of always the goal of a country, is to take in less than you sell. So the colonies want economic freedom. They don't want political freedom necessarily. They have it pretty good. And we have a lot of loyalty. There are people that are thinking about independence at this point, but it is not the majority opinion. Even when the war begins, it's not the majority opinion. But we have people that want to remain British subjects because they share culture with them, they share religion with them, they share family ties with them. There's a lot more similarities than they have than differences. But what they want to do is be able to trade with the French and trade with other people in the Western Hemisphere. They've had the luxury of having the Atlantic Ocean largely protect them from a lot of oversight up to this point. And they've been able to smuggle and things like that. But now they want a little bit more economic freedom to be able to sell the things that they have directly to the French without having to go through the British first, where they lose a lot of that profit. And so those are the main things that they want to get out of the French anymore, and they don't get either of those things. They get less economic freedom because now we're going to have all of these forms of taxation put upon them, you know, everything from the Sugar Act all the way down. And they get more and more intense as we go. And one of the things I put in my video on Wednesday is you can see at first the British are going to try to tax things that are so commonly consumed because they know that that's going to get quickly, there's going to raise them money that they need to pay back for the war. But as it goes down, it becomes more about punishment. And it becomes more about, I'm doing these things to prove a point, than it is about actually accruing money to pay back any debt. And so you can see kind of that progress, that back and forth escalate as time goes on. You know, as beginning, we have, you know, here's an act of taxation. We're going to boycott that product. We're going to repeal that you know, piece of legislation. We're going to go on to the next one. And so there's a back and forth that's kind of, you know, nonviolent. It's not super aggressive. It's, you know, it's actually getting the colonies to practice unification over, you know, a collective boycott on these products. And then obviously, as we get into the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party and things like that, things are going to heat up pretty quickly. Still not the majority opinion is going to be in favor of independence at that point. Mr. Bordas, do you want to add anything about the French Indian War while we're at this point?
No, just saying that some people believe that it's the first true world war because, remember, it's fought all over the place. It's not just fought in North America. They're fighting in Europe. They're fighting in Asia. You know, the French want India. The British want India. So there's a lot more involved here than just the colonies. Because the British are fighting in so many places, they have an advantage over the French because there are so many more British colonists in North America than French. The French were much less densely populated. As a result, most of the native tribes sided with the French because they didn't consider them to be as much of a threat. And, you know, everything that you've said about the results of the war are true. The British war debt is raised. As a result, the taxes come in place. Mrs. Hall was correct when she said they are pushing them toward independence without really knowing they are pushing them toward independence. There are a few people in British Parliament, such as Edmund Burke and William Pitt the Younger, who are arguing with their fellow members of Parliament that we are pushing these people away. We have something very valuable here, and we are not going to realize how valuable it is until we actually lose it. So, you know, these ideas are out there. Remember, they are falling back on a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers here, guys like Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire figure in, not so much Hobbes, because Hobbes was a guy who was not really all that in favor of the
absolute
democracy.
Monarchies.
Yeah. He doesn't like the idea of a republic. And he would have been a guy who was not in favor of the American Revolution. He would have been a guy who was not in favor of the English Revolution, if you remember back to that one, and King Charles and what happened to him. So, you know, the British have established themselves as a constitutional monarchy, which is a form of democracy. And the colonists can't understand why they will not extend this democracy to them, because they are bringing so much to this relationship between the two sides, but they are being ignored. This whole concept of virtual representation makes absolutely no sense to them. Like, it wouldn't make any sense to you or me today to somebody say, oh, well, we will only look out for your best interests. Well, if you don't have a say in that, why would they look out for your best interests? You can't put any pressure on these people. So there's just this whole, they just can't see eye to eye here, the two sides, and more people will start coming over. I typed in that really, Mrs. Hall mentioned that very few people are talking about political independence at this point. Why would you want to break away from the most powerful military country in the world, the most powerful economic country in the world, and that they want to stay in this relationship for the most part? Most of these people, really the first two who really start throwing around that word independence would be a guy like Sam Adams, who would be a radical.
Sons of Liberty.
Yeah, and his ideas about the Sons of Liberty is correct. And don't forget the Daughters of Liberty and the part that they play in this whole American Revolution. And if you want to go and find a Southerner who is starting to echo some of the things that Adams is talking about, Sam Adams, that would be Patrick Henry.
Mm-hmm.
And remember his idea about how far is he willing to go for this idea.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Yeah, so, but those guys are in the minority. All independence movements really start with a small number of people who then have to gather more and more people. The American Revolution is no different. Think about other revolutions, whether they are good or bad revolutions. Like we as Americans probably don't think, oh, that communist revolution that took over in Russia or China was a good thing. But it started out with a small number of people, as did, Hitler's ideas about fascism, speaking of bad revolutions that took place. So you have to rally people around your cause. And, we think our cause was right. We would think some of those other causes would not be correct.
And, it was a perfect storm in terms of the colonies. And I think we talked about this some last week, but also in class that, from the moment that the colonists got here, it was almost inevitable that this would happen at some point. You've got your own people settling land that believe that they are entitled to a status that you don't believe that they're entitled to. You've got a fair high level of literacy in the colonies. You've got money there. You've got, Enlightenment thinkers, Enlightenment influenced people. You've got practicing people that have experience. This is a big thing I talked about on Wednesday in my video. You have people with experience in democracy. They know how things should be, in their opinion, based on these Enlightenment ideals, versus places like the French or the Haitians or Latin America, where these other revolutions in the same time period are going to happen. Those people have a lower level of literacy and or have no experience with democracy. They don't know anything else from an absolute kind of monarchy situation. And so how do you expect people to, without those experiences, to be able to pull off something like that? So, the ingredients that are brewing in the colonies make it almost inevitable for this to happen. It was written in the Mayflower Compact, where they believed that they were equipped and qualified to run their own government.
Yeah, and think about the House of Burgesses. Again, it's wealthy white guys who are doing this, but that goes all the way back to 1619. They formed their own legislature there in the colony of Virginia. And, these are important steps. These are setting the groundwork for, what is about to take place. The people in England cannot understand why the colonists are even thinking about, kind of throwing a monkey wrench into this thing and talking a little bit about this independence, because the standard of living of the colonists is far better than the standard of living of the people in England. So economically, they're doing much better. Their problem comes to be that, we're being taxed too much and we don't have any say so. So it's the political rights that they feel they are being denied. Remember, if they were arrested for smuggling, their trials would take place outside of the colonies. They want to be tried by people who are their peers, fellow colonists, and the British are going to try them in military courts, which is a much more strict form of justice that you'll receive.
And remember, that was after the Boston Massacre, where there was that trial that quite narrowly almost convicted British soldiers in a colonial court, and they were like, we're not going to have this anymore. This is absolutely ridiculous. And so again, if you're a colonist that you commit a crime, you're not staying there to be tried for your crime. You're having to go back and face Englishmen, an English court system, and nobody that knows you and cares about you. And, presumed innocence is not really a thing. And so remember, all these revolutions start with the educated urban elite. So like Mr. Borda said, like a Sam Adams, like, John Adams, like Thomas Jefferson, like, all these other guys that are writing these documents are all the educated urban elite that believe that they, are the sole, saviors of this potential republic. And so the American Revolution, we have Lexington and Concord. That happens before, the Declaration of Independence. Mr. Boyce, you are such an aggressive typer. I can hear you over here.
Sorry.
You need to apologize to that keyboard. My goodness.
Heavy on the keys.
But Lexington and Concord happens before any of these independence documents are drafted. Again, when the fighting starts, and again, also harkening back to the French Indian War, this is where George Washington makes his, his presence known in the French Indian War. He wasn't very good, but that's how people know him, and they respect him. He's an intimidating figure. He's tall, much taller than the average colonist, and military experience. He's soft-spoken, but he's firm. And so they are going to, in the Second Continental Congress, appoint him to the head of the Continental Army. But before that, we're going to have attempts at the Olive Branch Petition in the First Continental Congress. Let's try to, solve this problem with the British. Let's try to remain colonists. In that document, it talks about like an olive branch is like a peace sign, right? So let's try to solve this problem together. Let's try to come up with, a mutually agreeable situation. King George has no interest in negotiating with the colonists, so that doesn't go anywhere. We have fighting that begins. The colonists get absolutely, schooled in that first, encounter at Lexington. They have to regroup, and they have to use some tactics that they learned from the French Indian War, like ambush techniques that the native populations would use. And that's really the only way that they're going to be able to have any sort of victory there, because they're just not disciplined. They don't have the training. They don't have the support, the training, the background that the British military has. And so they're going to have to use some unconventional, ungentlemanly tactics. The British do not fight in ungentlemanly ways. You should meet on a field. You should face each other, and you should fire at each other, and the best organized, the best disciplined military should win. Well, the colonists don't stand a chance if they do that. And so they're going to have to kind of find other ways. But the turning point is going to be when the French get involved, obviously. And they're able to support them with a navy, create a blockade so that British troops can't be replenishing their supplies, and help support with their military presence, and get across the finish line and have the British give up. Mr. Boris, is there like specifics you want to talk about besides the Continental Army, the Continental Congresses for the American Revolution?
No, just that, there are steps to it. I just typed in there that, you start with that circular letter by Samuel Adams. That's after Massachusetts, in particular Boston, is cut off after the Boston Tea Party. Remember that the British come down on them pretty hard. They take away their political right to control their own things that are going on in the colony, and they also close the harbor, which damaged them severely economically. After the circular letter, that leads to committees of correspondence. They start in Massachusetts. They will spread to other colonies. So like we said, the British think that they're punishing them. Yes, they are punishing them, but they are now drawing them closer together. So that circular letter spreads, then the committees spread. Then you get to the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress, where, the Olive Branch Petition was a last-ditch attempt. If you remember the video that we watched, John Dickinson was very much involved in that. He was one of those guys who did not want to break away from England. And it leads to the Olive Branch Petition, which the king rejects. And then you have the fighting at Lexington, Concord, followed by Bunker Hill, which is really Breed's Hill. And Mrs. Hall is right. The importance of the French, they had been supporting the colonies for some time. Now they become an official ally after the Battle of Saratoga, because they believe the colonists may actually be able to win this thing. And anything that's bad for the British is good for the French, is good for the colonists. And we all know this is going to culminate at the Battle of Yorktown. Battle of Yorktown, Cornwallis puts himself in a bad position in that he gets himself trapped on a peninsula. The British are forced to surrender. And that's really the last major battle of the American Revolution, which I'll leave Ms. Hall to talk about this part here, the Peace Treaty of 1783.
Right. So, and again, it's interesting because when the French help out, it's really because they hate the British, right? So there's that constant rivalry between the French and the British. And ultimately, the help that they provide inspires people even within France to think about independence themselves, which is obviously not an intended consequence, but is an unfortunate one for the French monarchy. But then it starts a whole chain reaction after that of, the anti-federalists and the federalists talking about whether we need to support the French then when they go through their revolution. Jefferson saying, the heart of revolution is strong in France and we need to go over there and help. And, Ben Franklin has been over there. And so it's, trying to decide whether, since they supported our revolution, that we should support theirs. But the Treaty of Paris happens in France, one, because they were our allies, but also because most treaties are taking place in France, because the Treaty of Versailles is like the epitome of, political negotiation in Europe. And so this is going to say that the British are going to have to leave. The colonists' independence is recognized. The British are not actually going to leave right away, and that's going to be a problem, obviously, for a while. But this is, the formal recognition where the colonies are recognized as an independent nation by the rest of the world. And, before, the Declaration of Independence was the colonies recognizing themselves, but that had, it's kind of like if you wrote your parents a letter and said, I'm now free, and they're like, sure. And so it really doesn't have a whole lot of ground to stand on. And now this formal declaration is going to tell the world that it's possible. And that's going to be a big problem in a lot of places around the world, because now we have a blueprint for revolution. And this is going to inspire other colonies to say, if the Americans can do it, so can we. Maybe we should throw off the shackles of our colonial, oversight, and we should challenge, imperial power, because this also shows that the British are not impenetrable, that they can be defeated by a group that was undisciplined, kind of ragtag, obviously educated, obviously had money, but not nearly as much. I mean, this was the biggest naval power in the world. And a group that should not have won was able to. And this is going to have significant global impact, geopolitical power shifts and questioning of political power. Britain is going to start to shift their focus to the jewel of the crown. They're going to shift primary focus to India after this. But this is a really big deal. It's going to have a big impact in other places, and we are going to love it when other places want to use our Declaration of Independence as a blueprint for their own revolutions, and they're going to formulate their revolutions as ours. It's, the greatest compliment that we can get, that we were the ones that did it right. But obviously, having an ocean away from our imperial power is a big help, and other components that we've already talked about were a big help in the success of that revolution. But certainly, other places won't have that luxury. So now we have the coastline here that will all belong to the newly, declared United States. And now we have a whole series of decisions to make about what our new government is going to look like. And this is what we call the critical period, because this is our first test. Now that we're free, we need to create a document that solidifies how we're going to function. And a lot of colonies had been experimenting with different things. And now we've got to implement it. And what is the number one thing that all the colonies really agree upon in terms of what this document must include? Or better say, what is it not going to include?
A strong central government. It would have a weak central government.
Exactly. And that makes sense. I mean, you do have people in there, like a John Adams would say, but it's very much that critical period where you need to show the people that you're recognizing why this war was fought in the first place. We have an all-powerful monarchy. It is, as Mr. Rohr said, it is not in line with the Enlightenment or even how things are run in Britain. So we need to make a government that makes sense for us. And we are already divided up into these states. So that is where the power should be, that local governments should have the authority to make decisions for themselves, that people should be represented by those states, and therefore, the emphasis should be on local authority, because we cannot afford to fall back on what we have just gotten rid of. And as you can, if you remember from world history last year, pretty much every revolution follows the same pathway, right? So you have this moderate kind of revolution that's expected. The educated urban elite have very kind of conservative expectations. They mainly want to expand more power to themselves. And then it becomes more radical, where the expectations start to spread to some of the uneducated, and they start to want more drastic, more dramatic changes. And then what do you end up with? Largely what you got rid of in the first place. And, you know, while we have maintained a democracy and we have separation of powers and we have all these different checks and balances, I think most people can argue, no matter what political party you are, that we have a central government that exerts a whole lot of power. And we could see that expanding so quickly and dramatically, especially in the 20th century and obviously during times of war in the 19th century. But that is our biggest concern, is that we do not want to have a central government that is going to be like a king. We have to do everything we can. And we watched that segment of John Adams where he says we need to take particular care to make sure that this does not happen. And so we have the Articles of Confederation, which are absolutely vital first step for the colonies to make sure that their worries are alleviated, that we make sure that people are recognized. Here's our original states. But we know that there are lots of problems with the Articles, that, you know, the fact that you can't collect taxes, and if you can't collect taxes, you can't fund national efforts. And you can't regulate commerce, you can't regulate trade between states or with foreign powers. So it's like every state functions like, as the term says, a state. A state is an autonomous political body. And every state was, you know, coining its own money. Every state was deciding its own trade terms. Every state was having to do its own militia. This is not a country. This was a set of autonomous states loosely tied to one another. And some people believe this is exactly how it should be. But we have a number of events that cause us to see that this is actually not going to work out. The Whiskey Rebellion, or the Whiskey Rebellion is during Washington's administration.
Whiskey's during Washington. Shays Rebellion.
Shays Rebellion, thank you. So Shays Rebellion is where it comes to a head, that we realize that, you know, if states refuse to pay their taxes, we can't collect them. What do we do? And so we have got to come up with a way to kind of improve this system. And with the Articles, it was nearly impossible to amend the Articles. Like, it required such a high standard of states to agree, and that was never going to happen. We know that from the development of the colonies, that each of those regions develops in such a different kind of way, different groups of people, different kinds of occupations, different expectations, different literacy, different density of population in terms of Africans brought there for slavery versus free people. But obviously no executive branch was so important for people to see. There was no court system to settle disputes between states. And so there wasn't really a sense that people were American. It was a sense that people were Georgians or were Virginians or were, you know, whatever they were, you know, local affiliation much more than a national one. And so there's not a whole lot that you can achieve by doing that. And so these men get together in Philadelphia and say, we can't fix this. We've got to just start over. This is a document that will not work. And so they meet in secret because they don't want a whole lot of outside influence. They don't want everybody giving their 2 cents. They don't want the doors being, you know, broken down, people trying to voice their opinions. They want to be able to kind of be clear-headed and make a decision and have these debates within the confines of you know, a closed meeting, so that they can try to sort out what the next step should be. And this is really, you know, a testament to the resiliency of the Americans, because, you know, many countries and many of these revolutions, as we've talked about, attempt a document, it doesn't work, and then they just end up going back to what they started with. They don't have the ability, they don't have the resiliency, they don't have the confidence to amend, to change, to make alterations, to say, you know what, that didn't work, let's try something else.
Yeah, think about what happens during the French Revolution. I mean, you're breaking away from this all-powerful absolute monarchy, and what do they end up with? They end up with Napoleon as a dictator, right? So that's not what's going to happen here, obviously, or we wouldn't be sitting here today. So they have to come up with ideas. And the 2 guys who really called for this meeting in Philadelphia were Alexander Hamilton of New York and James Madison of Virginia. Remember, these guys believe in a stronger central government at this point. Madison's going to be called the father of the Constitution. Many of the ideas that are going to be put in place are going to be Hamilton's ideas. So it's important that Madison shows up along with Edmund Randolph, who was a fellow Virginian. He shows up with a plan in hand called the Virginia Plan, and he's got the jump on anybody else who might have a rival plan. And he is talking about what you need to remember about this is large states. So the large states at the time would have been Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York. So he thinks that these states should be the leading states. They should have more representation than anybody else because they have so many people who live in the states. So this idea of population will determine representation. Well, the smaller states aren't just going to sit back and allow this to happen. So a guy named William Patterson from the small state of Virginia, he'll present the the New Jersey plan. And the New Jersey plan is basically, sounds a lot like the Articles of Confederation. He still wants to have one house of Congress. He still wants to have one vote per state so that the large states with their greater population won't be able to outvote the smaller states. And they're kind of going back and forth here. And, there's some talk that, hey, we're going to have two countries. But it takes a guy like Roger Sherman from Connecticut to introduce, which sometimes is called the Sherman Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, Great Compromise, goes by any one of those names. And he talks about taking ideas from both. So to satisfy the small states, he's going to have an organization like the Senate that is going to have equal representation, 2 senators per state. So they like that. But you have to do something to satisfy the large states. That's where the House of Representatives comes in, and its concept of representation based on population. But they're not done compromising. The compromise has to extend to that issue. Remember that issue that Southern states wanted taken out of the Declaration. That was Jefferson, where he was saying this idea of slavery has to end in the United States, which is kind of strange considering Jefferson was a slave owner, as were many of the founding fathers. So they have to compromise there, what's called the 3/5 compromise. And the 3/5 compromise is, all right, we will give the southern states, the states that are dependent on this slavery, because remember they have cash crops depending on which state you're in, whereas the economies in the north grew up such that they didn't have this need for cash crops. They didn't have a need for slavery. So slavery is starting to die out in those states, but it's thriving in the South. So they want their slaves counted for purposes of representation. And the northern states are going to say, well, all right, if we're going to end up having a compromise here, we will count them for population, but we will also tax them too. So that is this concept of the 3/5 compromise. You're also going to have the issue of where's the national capital going to be? So remember, Philadelphia was the place, then Washington is going to be inaugurated in New York. Well, that's eventually going to shift. That's going to be in this swampy place that's going to become known as Washington, D.C. And that is a compromise that takes place with guys like Madison and Jefferson and Hamilton when they're going to come up with Alexander Hamilton's plan about economics. Okay, like how is this country going to be set up economically? How does it need to be set up so that it can be successful? Because remember, they have no money. Nobody wants to loan them money. People think they're going to fall apart. Washington himself said, I give this new country like 20 years before, because of all this infighting that's taking place. So, Ms. Hall, did I leave anything out there?
No, I mean, it just has in here also the idea of, the term limit. Again, as the founders knew when they came up with the idea that they were going to have a federal government, and they're going to have this sort of role of, a central figure at some point. That's going to be a delicate situation, and having to decide how long are they going to serve? How many terms do they get to serve? Do they serve a life term? I mean, some people were saying they should serve for life, and then once they die, we vote for somebody else. And then, should they serve 10-year terms? Should they serve 2-year terms? Should they serve 1-year terms? Should they not be able to have consecutive terms? And we know that there's not any limitation put on the number of terms that a president can serve until we get to FDR in the 20th century. But that is one of those concerns. And then, we watched that silly segment from John Adams where it talks about what we should call them. And, they laugh at John Adams because he has these lofty royal terms that we should be calling, and Washington says, I'm just going to be Mr. President. And so, the idea of having the president be a position that is obviously elected by the majority with the Electoral College, which gives advantage to some of the heavier populated states. But you have to be elected you have to hit the majority. And Washington is able to do that for both of his terms. People see him as and we can talk round and round about what we think could have happened had somebody like John Adams been president instead. But Washington was very much of the mindset that I'm not of one particular party. I'm going to have people in my cabinet. I'm going to create a cabinet, a group of people that can help advise me that are going to come from lots of different kind of places and lots of different ideas. I mean, to think that you had Hamilton and Jefferson sitting at a table together at one point is, a testament to the fact that Washington welcomed conflict to a certain extent because he wanted to see kind of what the arguments were happening outside of the walls of the government. And, we're going to have some of our presidents do a better job than others of trying to keep a cabinet of a diverse perspective. But we know that Jackson's going to change a lot of that when, tradition is thrown out the window and he doesn't keep his cabinet intact when he becomes president. But, the president continues to be a position of a lot of conflict and a lot of controversy because it's such a delicate situation, trying to sell that to the American people that that's the right thing to do. But we know that they create three branches to help separate powers so that not everything. So yes, this is kind of, again, anytime you give something to the American people that sounds like it could be something like, they just fought to remove, you've got to kind of alleviate their worries and say, no, okay, so the president's going to be here, and then we're going to have things here, and we're going to have things here, and that's going to check them so that if they want to do something, it has to go through here also. And here is where the majority of power is. If you remember, the Articles was just a legislative branch. There was only one branch, one vote per state, and that was it. And so now we're going to build off of that. We're going to have a bicameral legislature, as Mr. Board has talked about with the Virginia and the New Jersey plan. We're going to go with the Great Compromise so that we can have big states having more representation here in the lower house, but then ultimately all states in the upper house are considered to be equal. Passing legislation has to happen with both chambers, and then it passes to the president, who then gets to make the decision if it's really the best thing for the people or not. Some people say, well, that's if it passes both houses here, then obviously the president shouldn't be able to veto it. But if you think about it, if you're a president of a different political party here and you've got a majority rule in both of these houses of the opposing party, you have things that you don't want to go into law, and you need to make sure that you can veto things that aren't just like a political ploy or a political gain at that moment for that party, that they're not trying to just take, dismantle things. And so you got to have checks to every decision. And then ultimately the judicial branch has, and that's, remember we talked about the third article of the Constitution, and it's the shortest one because the founders really didn't know what this branch was going to look like. They know that they needed a court system. They know that they needed something like this, but they didn't exactly know what they were going to do, what the structure was going to be. John Marshall is going to provide some more clarity about what that's going to be. And, you don't have to have any qualifications to be a Supreme Court justice. Everything else has all these strict requirements. To be president, you have to have an age requirement, a citizenship requirement, or this or that. To be senator, to be a congressman, you have to have all these requirements. There aren't any listed for the judicial branch except for being appointed by the president and then confirmed by the legislative branch. And so, hang on.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. My AirPods died. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yep.
I can hear you, Miss Hall.
Anybody? Can anybody hear me? Can anybody confirm you can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Uh-oh.
I don't think she can hear us.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay, sorry. So anyway, so the judicial branch, unlimited term. Once you get there, you can stay there for life. It takes a lot to get rid of a Supreme Court justice, but that's going to check all of the other things. They can rule decisions, pieces of legislation to be unconstitutional. They get to have the ultimate say. They're the ones that interpret the Constitution. And that's going to change. As we've seen multiple times, one interpretation of the Constitution at one point in history is not going to apply always. And so decisions are revisited constantly. I mean, if we didn't have a process of that, we would still have slavery. We would still have something like, Dred Scott stand. And so you have to have these kind of revisitations, reinterpretations of the text. That just goes to show you that the Constitution is a breathing document. We create a federal system, so there are levels. So within every branch, you've got a federal system, a state system, and then a local system, so that it can function on multiple levels and satisfy different levels of concern. And then you've got obviously the supremacy clause that says at the end of the day, state laws can't get in the way of federal laws. So that's McCulloch versus Maryland, that decides that at the end of the day, the federal government has the ultimate say, which is concerning in some ways, because again, if you're concerned about a government having too much power, that's an indication that that could quite possibly happen. And so, you have to take particular care to oversee and check the federal government when you can. And so here is a nice chart that you can look at to see kind of the progress that the colonists take in terms of becoming the United States and then solidifying what kind of government they were going to have over time. And you can take a look at this. But this is basically all we were just talking about. Mr. Borders, you want to talk about the Washington presidency?
I'm sorry, Washington's presidency does put together a very capable cabinet. Obviously, the two dominant figures in there would be Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton being Secretary of the Treasury, he's the money man. Jefferson, who had a lot of experience in terms of foreign policy, Secretary of State. He also spoke so many languages that he could communicate with just about anybody out there in their language. You had Henry Knox, if you remember from the video, The Crossing. He was the kind of portly guy who Washington makes fun of a few times. He becomes his Secretary of War, which we would call Secretary of State today. And then Edmund Randolph is the Attorney General. And the Attorney General is the person who is in charge of all legal matters in the United States. He would be the guy who today is in charge of the FBI and all of those organizations. So he sets policy. Obviously, the president's policy is what is set, but he shapes the policy. So these four guys are going to be the advisors to Washington. You probably saw in the video about John Adams, Mrs. Hall may have shown you the clip. I know I showed it, where Washington is just so fed up with all the arguing in his cabinet meetings. He's sitting there and Jefferson is arguing and Hamilton's arguing with each other, and outside trying like a fly on the wall is Adams listening in. And Washington will come out and he'll ask Adams, he pretty much says, hey, I'm in need of some more moderate, more stable advice. Would you please have dinner with me? That scene. And it starts to wear on Washington. He did not want to be president in the first place. He agrees to the job. He does not want to be president for a second term. They talk him into it. So he's a very reluctant president, this head of the branch of government, the executive branch. And in history, some people compare him to a guy from ancient Rome, a guy named Cincinnatus, who you have to remember, Cincinnatus was a guy who saved Rome. He came back from being a farmer. He takes over the government. They had a tyrant in place for a while, and a tyrant was not necessarily a bad person. If the country was in need of one strong leader, that's where he stepped up. But then he went back to farming. And the same is true with Washington. Mrs. Hall said, he could have been elected however many times he wanted to be elected. He could have been president for life. But that is not the precedent that he wants to set. He does not want to die in office. He does not want to be that guy who sets the precedent of our leaders die in office, and then we, probably pick somebody who's related to the leader or somebody who was a top advisor to the leader. So, he's going back and forth here, and Jefferson is trying to win him over toward his side, and Hamilton is trying to win him over to his side. Remember that Washington and Jefferson are both Virginians. Hamilton is a New Yorker. He was an immigrant who settled there. And, the stuff that he achieved going from rags to riches, he and Jefferson are very, very different guys. Their philosophy on government is very different. Hamilton wants a strong central government. That's why he's going to be head of that political party that grows called the Federalists. Jefferson will be an anti-federalist. They were speaking out. They were the guys who said, we're not signing off on this Constitution unless you have a Bill of Rights, which will eventually be added. So he'll come to be the guy who heads the Democratic Republican Party, which evolved from those anti-federalists. Hamilton wanted to have a country that was like England. It would be a country that would be based on finance and trade. Jefferson wanted to have a country that was like France, in that it would be a country that was based on an agrarian, a farming society. So all this stuff is going on here at this point. Hamilton realizes that we have to have a government that is stable. That's where he comes up with his financial plan. And his financial plan is the Bank of the United States, which Jefferson says, that bank is unconstitutional because it doesn't allow to have that in the Constitution. Nowhere is it written that a bank can be created. That's where Hamilton comes up with his loose interpretation of the Constitution, whereby he means, because it doesn't say I can't do it in the document, that means we can do it in the document. So as Ms. Hall earlier said, that's going to revert back to an interpretation. That job is done by the court system. And being that John Marshall is a Federalist down to the bone, he's going to be the guy who's going to say, all right, loose interpretation. Almost all of his interpretations are loose, which is going to set Jefferson off because he wants a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which, as we'll see here very soon, he's going to violate some of that strict interpretation of the Constitution. But Washington's presidency, things to probably remember are obviously the precedents that he sets, his farewell address, where he says we should not have political parties. Okay, well, that's inevitable. And he also says we should avoid entangling permanent foreign alliances. That policy will hold until shortly after World War II, when the United States actually forms a political alliance called NATO that it will join. So for all those years, Washington's policy was the policy that they practiced. A couple things other that happened in Washington's presidency would be the Whiskey Rebellion, which takes place at home. Farmers in Pennsylvania didn't like the fact that corn, which was used to make whiskey, and they're going to both be taxed at this point, which, puts a financial strain on these people. They're thinking back to Shays' Rebellion and how that kind of got rolling. But the Whiskey Rebellion doesn't go that far because now you don't have an Articles of Confederation. You have a Constitution, which gives the federal government the ability to raise an army. Washington's going to march that army out, and then at the last point, he's going to say to Hamilton, all right, you take them the rest of the way. And when these farmers in Pennsylvania see this pretty intimidating army, the revolt, I should say, kind of just melts away. Washington shows what a benevolent guy he is. He could have had all these guys executed for this uprising against the government, but he says he gives everybody a pardon. So now people love him even more as a result of this. A couple treaties that happened under Washington's presidency would be what's the first one? It slips my mind. Right, Jay's Treaty. Jay's Treaty was not that popular because it was with England, but the United States was not dealing from a position of power. The English were more powerful than the United States, so we didn't come out that great on that treaty. But Washington wanted it. The Senate approved it. The treaty that everybody loved was Pinckney's Treaty because that opened up access to the Mississippi River for American people who traded, merchants and such. They could now go down the Mississippi. They could dump out into the port of New Orleans, which gave them access to the Gulf of Mexico, which gave them access to the Atlantic. So trade is going to really be helped by this treaty. Anything I forgot, Ms. Hall?
Republican motherhood.
Yes, Republican motherhood.
Of course you did.
So what you have to remember about Republican motherhood is you have to think about somebody like Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams was trying to instill that in her children. All American mothers were expected to instill this in their children, that this is how government works in the United States and everybody plays a role. If you are going to be one of these people, you have to have an education. You have to understand how this system works, because if you don't understand it, then the system could be abused. So this idea of Republican motherhood will continue, and this is the role you play as a woman. But remember, women did not have access, at least at this point, to an education like men did.
And remember, Hamilton and a number of others don't want everybody to vote. That's why the Electoral College is created, is there is a fear of a mob mentality. There's a fear that uneducated people will voice their opinion and they won't really know what they want and know what's good for them. And so, there are a number of people who create systems in place so that, enough people participate that it's a democracy. But in reality, the expectation that everybody votes is kind of an unreasonable one. And so, keeping in mind that the American Revolution and the first administrations of the country are taking place during the first major industrial revolution. We like to think about that as happening at the beginning of the 18th century. And so we have a burst of new inventions that are making lives easier, especially with relation to agriculture. So we've got the cotton gin that is going to revitalize slavery. It was dying out, and then suddenly it is going to be reignited because now you can work so much more land with the same amount of people. Mechanizing that process of getting the bolls out of cotton is going to make that process so much more profitable. And so to an institution that was supposedly going to disappear on its own, which is what people like Jefferson believed. I mean, when they said that we're not going to want that in the Constitution, we don't want that in the Declaration, we don't want that in any of our founding documents, we're not ready for that yet. They believed that innately the system was just going to go away on its own. But the cotton gin kind of took that and made it so that it was too profitable to let go of yet. We have the Samuel Slater factor. We've got a whole lot of things. Mr. Boris talked about Hamilton and the Bank of the United States. That becomes kind of a compromise between him and Jefferson. He gives the capital ends up being closer to Virginia than it is these northern states in New York, so that it's like a tit for tat. But obviously, Jefferson does not want the bank. But when Jefferson is president, he does not veto the bank. And so that is something that I think, as we talk about Jefferson, he has this identity crisis where he has to try to figure out who he's going to be as president, and it's not exactly the person that he wanted to be. And so Washington serves his 2 terms, and then his vice president becomes president. And what's really interesting is that we do, in the beginning, when we have elections of our early presidents, remember that whoever gets first place number of votes gets to be president, and whoever gets the second most votes gets to be vice president. And that doesn't exactly set you up for a group of people that really want to work together. Now, obviously, Washington will be an exception to that rule, but if you think about Adams with Jefferson as his vice president, that's a train wreck. And so, we're going to have to amend that process of how you run for the vice presidency. But you have Adams who wants to, he has to fill the shoes of Washington, which everybody loved Washington. He was this figure that, had he was unanimously elected. And then, people wanted him to run, as Mr. Bordas said, he didn't want to run again. And Adams desperately wants to be president, right? He wanted to be the first president, in fact. Remember, he's a sociopath through and through. He wants to save he believes he alone has the vision that's right for the newly formed United States. But his presidency is just riddled with problems. And he says he's not of a political party, but we know he edges on the side of the Federalists because he believes in the validity of having a strong central government to keep people together. But, he passes a series of unfortunate and unpopular pieces of legislation. His presidency is started off with, he leaves the presidency with controversy over the midnight judges and Marbury v. Madison. But we've got the Alien Sedition Acts, which say don't talk crap about the government, because some people are saying we need to go to war with the French. He's saying no, we don't. Let's wait this out. That comes from the XYZ affair, which is down here in our foreign developments and the quasi-war with the French. And we want to deal with this issue of impressment of our soldiers, of our sailors, and freedom of the seas. And, we don't want to bribe to be able to see these high-ranking officials. We want to be able to directly negotiate with the French. We take such an offense to that process. And we almost go to war with France, but then we don't, because Adams holds off. He says we need to wait this out, and eventually it blows over, and it was the right decision. But Abigail Adams is the one that says you need to pass this because people are not knowing what they're talking about, and they're not doing what's right. And so she fervently supported him with this, and it became super unpopular because people like Jefferson, even as vice president, is saying you can't do that. That is impeding on our civil liberties. We have the right, the freedom of speech. We have the right to criticize our government. That is innately what our system is founded on, and you're taking that away. And so, we have states, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. There's attempts to nullify and say, if we don't believe that that law is just, we're not going to follow it. And so Adams' administration is just full of problems. And it just eats away at him. And when it comes time for the Revolution of 1800, which is, what we call that election because we have to switch parties, he comes in third place. And so we've got, Jefferson and tied with Burr. And then Burr ends up losing when it comes down to the final vote because Hamilton is going to vouch for Jefferson over Burr, and that we know is going to eventually lead to the Burr and Hamilton duel, the famous duel. But yeah, people do not like Adams. They believe he is a know-it-all. They believes he's an elitist, that he, especially as, vice president, he says, I am nothing, and he almost doesn't accept the vice presidency. I am nothing, but I could also be everything because you're a heartbeat away from the presidency. You're a tie-breaking vote in the Senate. But most of what we see in that John Adams series about him as vice president is that he's sitting there reading a newspaper while he's overseeing the Senate and watching them argue. And he is just distraught. But then the presidency is not what he had envisioned it to be. And so he's present during the Second Great Awakening, where we have a second attempt to spread religious fervor, even more than even the first one. This one's even more emotional, but these backcountry outside gatherings, trying to reignite religious, religious affiliations, religious conversions, and also kind of reigniting interest in democracy, reigniting interest in self-improvement, and connecting with nature and all these other things that we know are going to impact American culture in the next couple decades. So, did I leave anything out, Mr. Bordas? John Adams?
No, I just typed in a couple comments that that issue of the Alien and Sedition Acts is something that the country's going to wrestle with time and time again as we move through history. Lincoln and his whole habeas corpus issue is power of the federal government, power of the president versus individual rights. And then Woodrow Wilson with the Sedition Acts in World War I, where somebody like Eugene Debs goes to prison for a number of years for speaking out against the government. FDR, the same thing. You could not say certain things. You could not do certain things during World War II that you normally can do. And then that takes you to the whole Patriot Act question that you have today with the war on terror that started, with 9/11. And here we are almost 20 years later. And that comes up for renewal. And every year it has been renewed, even though there are people who speak out against it. If you remember, Benjamin Franklin, all the way back during the earliest days of the United States, said, be careful about how many rights you give away, because before you know it, your government may take away more rights than you ever thought possible.
Right. And so that's again, if we're thinking about this is divided into two time periods, this is the end of that time period, 1754 to 1800. And now we're getting into the next time period, which starts with Jefferson and the reign, the Virginia dynasty. And, you know, Jefferson's such an interesting president because he has these lofty ideas of, like Mr. Borda said, an agrarian society, small national government, large local government, and he has to abandon so many of those from the onset of his presidency. Obviously, when he comes into office, Marbury v. Madison's an issue where he, on the way out of office, Adams appoints all of these justices, because if you think about it, if you want to have a legacy, if you want to impact government well beyond the time that you're there, the place that you do it is the Supreme Court and the court system, because those are the people that are interpreting the government. And even if you're gone, and the opposing political party and then, you know, a political philosophy is in charge, if you have people in the courts that are interpreting the laws, they can say that something is against the Constitution and it's struck down without any other motion. And so that's where you have the biggest impact. And so Adams makes all these late appointments, not all of them get delivered. Jefferson believes that they shouldn't be delivered. And so he those that hadn't been delivered, he demands that they are not delivered. Those people do not get their appointments. And so this is the case where we get judicial review as the main purpose of the Supreme Court, where they have the right to oversee the actions of the other branches and make sure they're in alignment with the Constitution.
Hey, Ms. Hall, why didn't Adams just stack the court like FDR proposed?
And the Constitution didn't necessarily say he couldn't, so I'm kind of surprised that maybe he didn't try to do something like that. So obviously in the onset, we have Napoleon comes to the United States and says, hey, I have a proposition for you. I'm willing to sell you all of this land. If you want it, you know, it's yours. $10 million, you can have everything. Or was it 14? Was it 10 or 14, Mr. Bordas?
10 or 14 what? I'm sorry.
$1 million.
I thought it was 15, but close enough.
Well, there we go.
Close enough.
But I mean, it's this huge plot of land that had been owned by the French, and in reality, all we wanted was the Mississippi River. We wanted New Orleans, and that's really it. And Jefferson said, "How about this little piece?" And he's like, "Nope, take it all or leave it." And Jefferson so badly wanted a constitutional amendment that said he was going to be allowed to do that, and he could not get it passed in time because Napoleon said, "This deal is on the table right now. If you want it, you got to take it, or else I'm going to offer it to the Spanish." And so he took it, and he hated himself for it. He is president during an economic crisis, he creates one, so to speak. We have an issue with impressment of soldiers by the French and the British, and so he decides that we are going to place a halt on all trade with European countries so we cannot take a side, because remember, Washington said in his farewell address, avoid entangling alliances, which we can't abide by any of the things that he laid out. But Jefferson wants to avoid war at all costs, so he says we're not going to trade with anybody.
So does everybody remember "Oh Grab Me"?
That political cartoon?
Yeah.
Let's see. Here we go. And so obviously it has embargo spelled backwards. And people are furious. And as you can imagine, the significant impact on the economy that this is going to have. And Jefferson this is in his second term. You can see he's on his way out. It's in the very end of his presidency. And even on his way out, he starts to relieve a little bit of that embargo. And just say that we are not going to trade with countries that are at war or different things like that. So he's going to make some concessions, but a lot of that's going to be rolled back in the coming years. But we will see the non-importation of slaves, and he is going to see that issue of slavery pushed back again. And so they make the decision that, when they write the Constitution, we're going to revisit this issue later. It's put on the back burner again. And this is where Jefferson also in these coming years is going to say that slavery is the fireball in the night that's going to end us. It is going to unravel everything. And we know that that becomes a true statement. But he's going to send troops to the Barbary to deal with the Barbary pirates. And so we're going to have a lot of situations where Jefferson's going to have to abandon his ideals. He sends, Lewis and Clark on the expedition to explore the new territory and to, send back samples, and he sends them with these coins as a sign of peace, and he wants them to chart this new land. He does a lot that exercises a tremendous amount of executive power, and he hates himself for it. At the end of his presidency, he ends up on his gravestone, or at the end of his life, everything that he does is listed there except for the presidency. He did not like his time as president. So, I mean, that's just kind of something to reflect on. I'm trying to think here. Oh, here. And again, he is a Democratic Republican. And so even though these are, strict interpretation of the Constitution, opposition to the National Bank, he ends up not pursuing a lot of that. He is pretty loose with the Constitution. He does not veto the National Bank. So there are a number of things that he has an opportunity to do and he doesn't, or decisions he makes that he ends up having to kind of go in an opposite direction. And he expands quite a bit of political power. But people see that as not the worst thing. And let's see, there's the Louisiana Purchase. And anything else, Mr. Bordas? Thomas Jefferson, Virginia Dynasty.
No, I think you've covered everything there. You want me to go into Madison real quick?
Yep.
You want me to do Madison?
Yes, I said yes.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. All right. So James Madison comes into the presidency, and James Madison is very much like Thomas Jefferson. He's like a protege of Jefferson's. When Jefferson was in France during everything that was happening with the Constitution, remember, he wasn't in the country. He was getting messages from guys like Madison. He was getting messages from James Monroe, who will be the next president, saying, hey, this is what's going on. So he's staying up to date on things that are there. Madison is.
Well, remember also Madison, as the father of the Constitution, he wrote the Federalist Papers, a number of them, and so he is going to go through kind of a political transformation in this early period, where really what turns his mind is going to be the Alien Sedition Acts, where he is going to write with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. He's going to be part of that, which will really turn him in kind of a different political direction.
Yeah, so it took something like that, the Alien and Sedition Acts, for him to reevaluate things. And that will be a huge change. Like Mrs. Hall said, you got the guy who was the father of the Constitution thinking that the constitutional rights of people are being infringed upon here. So, he's gonna come up with this concept. He and Jefferson come up with that concept that we're going to hear time and time again all the way through the Civil War, that idea of nullification, where remember, Jefferson and Madison wrote that it would be okay for you to nullify, basically ignore federal law if that violated your beliefs, if that law you believed was wrong. So really strange for the father of the Constitution to come up with that. So during his presidency, probably the biggest thing, he's got to deal with the after effects of Jefferson's embargo and getting the United States on a more firm financial footing. So that's going to take time. That's going to be issued. Remember, he's going to get 2 terms in office. 4 out of the first 5 presidents got 2 terms in office. The only one who didn't was poor John Adams.
The one that wanted it so badly.
Oh yeah, he did. I mean, he was extremely disappointed, and it's going to be tough. Yeah, and it's also going to be his son, who's only going to get 1 term in office too, where everybody seems to be getting 2 at this time. So he's got to deal with this financial crisis. He's got to deal with war with the British. So you've been trying to avoid war. You've been trying to follow Washington's policies. But you know what? There's going to be a group that comes to power in Congress, and that group is called the Warhawks. And the Warhawks are going to be led by 2 guys who just seem like they're never going to die, and that's going to be Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. Clay being a guy from Kentucky, Calhoun from South Carolina. So if these guys are really young and these guys are gaining prominence, then we know that the southern part of the country where Calhoun was from, and in particular the western part of the country where Clay is from, people are moving there. They're gaining power in terms of Congress, in particular the House of Representatives, because of additional population, means additional votes. So these guys are going to push and push and push, and they're going to push for war with Britain. And you're going to get the War of 1812, which is going to be referred to as, by some people, as Mr. Madison's War. They felt that he had stumbled into this war, that he was kind of duped by Napoleon. Because remember, if France is going to be at war with Britain, then it would benefit France for Britain to also be at war with the United States, which would distract them and have to make them put a lot of their effort and a lot of their money and things like that into this war against the United States. So it's kind of in reverse what happened during the American Revolution at this point. So you're going to get the War of 1812. We don't really get that much out of it. The war is pretty much a wash. And one of the things we do get, all right, I'm sure you've heard this story as to where Mrs. Hall got engaged. Okay, that would be Fort McHenry. So it's at Fort McHenry that the British are stopped. That's where Francis Scott Key's off in the harbor. He writes the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. So that is something that comes out of it. This sense of nationalism, all the Americans coming together, comes out of this. Remember, we did lose our capital. The British did burn Washington, D.C. They burned the White House. Madison had to escape thanks to Dolly. She ran back in and grabbed the portrait of Washington, which is that iconic portrait of him that everybody knows. When I was a kid growing up, I mean, that hung in every schoolhouse in the country back in the dark ages. And these are the things that he's probably remembered for, is mostly this War of 1812. Trying to think if there's anything else that comes out of this war. Yeah, this concept of nationalism. So remember, the Federalist Party during this war is going to have a meeting. That meeting's going to take place in Hartford, Connecticut. It's going to be the Hartford Convention. And they're throwing around some ideas at the Hartford Convention that sure sound like nullification, that possibly sound like, hey, they're thinking about secession. And as a result, people are going to look unfavorably upon the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party pretty much commits political suicide here because people see them as un-American. As a result, the party's going to die out, and you're only going to have one political party, which Mrs. Hall leads us to James Monroe and the era of good feelings.
Yeah, I mean, and the biggest thing, from the War of 1812 is the fact that we just don't lose, right? So we end up having a draw. The War of 1812 brings us Jackson out of the Battle of New Orleans. And so we've got a number of figures that emerge as a result of the War of 1812, but we also just have this tremendous sense that, like, this is our second American Revolution. This is our second attempt to show that the first one wasn't just a mistake, or wasn't just happenstance and wasn't actually supposed to happen. And so we've got and Tippecanoe and Tyler too. We've got a number of people that are going to come out of this time period that we're going to see again later. But Henry Clay, is obviously on the scene, as Mr. Bordas was talking about. We know he is going to never go away, and he is going to be part of any major political compromise decision for the next couple decades. He's just going to keep hanging on. And so this new nationalism that we have emerge as a result of the War of 1812 is going to allow us the political energy to do a whole lot of stuff and to make a whole lot of points out of nothing, right? So that's kind of what James Monroe's presidency is going to be really founded on, is just the aftermath of that war, and the American system, the idea that we can try to create a system based on industry and federal funding of infrastructure and tariffs and these other things that are going to benefit us domestically. And it's just like anything else. You put, it's a system to put America's economy first. And so this is, Henry Clay's brainchild, that he has this grand idea that is going to, feed off of the optimism that comes out of the war. And obviously our new national anthem and things like that. So Monroe is the official beginning of the era of good feelings, because again, we are just continuing this reign of Democratic Republicans. And we are going to, starting with Jefferson, we have a number of them that we have, 2 more presidencies here that are going to be Democratic Republicans. Before that's even broken, we kind of have a different idea about where that party goes. But a single political party system, but a lot of different groups within that. Like Mr. Bordas said, the Hartford Convention really kills the Federalist Party because it pushes them to such an extreme place that people are like, ooh, no, that's not going to work. But the Democratic Republicans of Jefferson are not going to be what we see at the end of this era of good feelings in terms of what the goals of a president that is a Democratic Republican is going to achieve. And so we've got the Missouri Compromise is one of the most notable. There are 2 real big things that you need to remember from Monroe, and one of them you can cheat by because his name is in it. But we've got the Missouri Compromise, which is the first big decision to really officially make a decision that we're not going to make a decision about slavery. And so we are going to divide the country along a line and say, states that are above this line are going to be free. States below that line are going to be slave, and we will only admit states evenly so that slave nor free states will have the majority in the Senate. And so they can't make decisions that override and kind of negatively benefit the other side. And so very little is going to get done about this issue of slavery. But it is kind of under, we talk about anytime the Gilded Age, the era of good feelings, any of these time periods that have kind of a positive name to them, we know that there's a whole lot of stuff going on underneath that is not positive. Slavery is rampant. It's expanding. That's why we're going to have this issue with Texas and the Mexican territory, because land is getting exhausted and it's spreading along the southern point where we need more land because you're not getting as much out of the land that you have. And so slavery is expanding along those southern states. We got the American system. We've got another economic panic as a result of, these different, instability with currency. We've got the Cumberland Road that's going to try to and it's going to be the national road that's going to be trying to connect the eastern states, the East Coast, and these port cities with more internal land to encourage more people to settle in that land. And so this period, we're going to see the Erie Canal. We're going to see other pieces of infrastructure that are going to be built to encourage more and more people to move, because we've got all this land now from the Missouri Compromise, but we haven't settled most of it. And this is land that people can be making money on. And so we're going to have all of these incentives and all of these things to say, yes, you're going to go out on that land. You might be by yourself for a while, but we're going to keep you connected. And the Erie Canal is that big project that is going to create a lot of cities. Buffalo, New York, and some of these other places were nothing before the Erie Canal comes through. And then suddenly there are these robust centers of commerce and life and populations. But the Cumberland Road is going to be an attempt to connect. And what we see, the biggest complaint about the American system is that these pieces of infrastructure are not making their way to the South. They are mostly just connecting the East with the Midwest, the northern Midwest, the Ohio River Valley, things like that. They're not really making their way to these southern states where they can benefit from these taxes that they're paying to increase infrastructure. The Lowell system is creating opportunities for women to work outside the home, to be self-sufficient, to have income. And so the Lowell factories, remember, are mostly in Massachusetts. Lowell, Massachusetts is where they start. But these young women, young unmarried women, go and work in these factories. Most of their money is sent back home, but they live in, dorms kind of in these areas that they, live, that they're looked after. And then they come and they go to work. And so they are, protected, but they're also getting an opportunity to work outside the home, which is a big, big move for women to try to have some sort of economic independence. Once you are married, you are not to work anymore. And so that doesn't quite expand out, but it's going to be kind of a first step for women to try to achieve some sort of independence where they can make an argument for suffrage. We've got different social developments, abolitionist movements to, have some sort of alternative for this issue of slavery. What do we do? What can we do with freed people? And how do we, move people back quotations to Africa, and, create these societies where people can choose to leave. But again, one of the biggest things you need to remember from James Monroe is the Monroe Doctrine. And that is this big, firm statement that we're going to make with foreign policy that still stands today, where we say, you know, the line in the sand is here. America is in the Western Hemisphere. If a European country, and really at the time, we're worried about Russia too, if you invade into our hemisphere, we have a right to declare war. And that's a sign of, you know, this is our influence, our sphere of influence is over here. And this is our first step to really make a national, or a global position in the world. Because what this is laying the groundwork for is influence in Latin America. We know that Teddy Roosevelt's going to be really big into that at, you know, beginning of the 20th century, as we start to see, you know, movements in Panama and things like that. But the groundwork is being laid here to say, this is our hemisphere. Stay out. And the Spanish-American War will be our last effort to get all European influence out of the Western Hemisphere. But this prevents new influences. Adams-Zonas Treaty. John Quincy Adams is the Secretary of State. He is the one that writes the Monroe Doctrine and the Adams-Zonas Treaty, and that's going to gain us more territory without having to go to war, which is pretty awesome. And John Quincy Adams is extremely good at what he does as Secretary of State in terms of negotiating new boundaries for us without having to fight over them. And so during the era of good feelings is when we take advantage of Europe, who is already occupied with other stuff. They're occupied with other wars that they don't have the energy to deal with saying no to us. They have no interest in coming into our hemisphere. So we make this position because they're kind of, you know, recovering from the Napoleonic Wars, and they have no interest in coming over and dealing with us at that moment. So they're not going to be able to call our bluff right now. They're not really in a position to do that. And we've also got these like underlying currents and interest in expanding suffrage for all men, well, all white men anyway, because we know in this upcoming administration, we're going to see expansion of democracy. But again, these things go hand in hand. So we've got Second Great Awakening, which is greater democratization of religion, and we've got expansion into the frontier. Anytime you see territorial expansion, you're going to see a desire for expansion of democratic participation, because in these new states, you're not going to have states looking like they do in the East. These new states look very different. They're settled by different, hardier kinds of people. Women are playing a huge role in the frontier in establishing these new territories. They are working very hard. They're working alongside men to tame this new land and to make something of this untamable land. And again, this is where, you know, you talk about the American spirit and the frontier thesis. This is where Americans are built, is on the frontier. And so with that, you don't have all these old money people in these new states. Why would you do that? If life was good for you in the East, why would you be moving west? And so these new states are going to have governments made up of different kinds of people. And if you've got people that wouldn't qualify to vote in the East, you've got to kind of change the rules, because otherwise you're not going to have any government in those new states. And so we start to see a loosening up of democracy as more westward expansion takes place.
All right, so we're ready to go on to Quincy real quick. I mean, he's going to be very quick, and then Andrew Jackson. So,
look at this foxy fellow right here.
Yeah, John Quincy Adams is the first president to ever have his photo taken, as you can see there. So Quincy Adams, he comes to the presidency as a result of that so-called corrupt bargain, where Andrew Jackson had more electoral votes, had more popular votes than anybody. However, he did not have one more than half. He did not have a majority of the electoral votes. So therefore, very controversial election. Quincy Adams will eventually become president. Corrupt bargain. Henry Clay involves himself. Remember, he's extremely powerful. If there is not a situation where you have somebody get enough electoral votes, then the House of Representatives decides it. And as Speaker of the House, he had influence. He could get people to come over to Quincy Adams' side, as he did. The so-called corrupt bargain was, well, Jackson's people felt that Quincy Adams had been rewarded, or had rewarded Clay, I should say, with the position of Secretary of State. And if you go all the way back to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and now John Quincy Adams, everybody who had been Secretary of State will become president. So Mrs. Hall mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. Those are really John Quincy Adams' words. The Adams-Zonas Treaty, that was John Quincy Adams that got the United States Spanish Florida at that point. The Spanish kind of handed it over because they could not hang on to it. But he is very much his father's son. He has the same opinions of government as his father had. And as a result, he's seen as a little bit too powerful. He's seen as a little too pushy. Remember, John Quincy Adams in the Adams video said, vanity. They always accuse me of vanity. Well, the same case here with Quincy. So when he runs for president the next time around, he's going to get burned by the fact that universal male suffrage is now in place. And the average man, Andrew Jackson, is the average man's president. So Jackson, who's still fuming, still steaming about the fact that he wasn't president from that earlier election, he's going to roll over John Quincy Adams in this next election. So as a result, now you usher in the era of Jackson. And we have to think of everything that is associated with Jackson. So you have things like the spoils system. Jackson believed that people got stale on their job, and it was a good thing to replace people, to rotate people in and out of office on a regular basis. Remember, Jackson
the kitchen cabinet, right?
He had that kitchen cabinet, which was his unofficial cabinet of prominent people, friends of his, and he would probably listen to them more than he listened to his so-called regular cabinet. Andrew Jackson, hero of that war in the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans. This propels him to the presidency as well. A lot of things are happening during his presidency. His initial vice president, his first time around, is John C. Calhoun. Well, John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson are going to have a falling out to the point where that was that so-called tariff of abominations, where Calhoun is from South Carolina, and South Carolina is threatening not to pay its taxes. Andrew Jackson says, you will pay your taxes. South Carolina says, well, we will secede. Jackson said, you will not secede. And the force bill gets passed through Congress, which is whereby Andrew Jackson felt he could send federal troops down there and force South Carolina to do what all the other states were doing, which was basically pay their taxes. And secession is not going to happen under Andrew Jackson. He is not going to be the president who oversees a breakup of the nation. He's a bit of a strange guy along the lines of Jefferson, too. Sometimes he comes down on the side of states' rights. Sometimes he comes down on the side of federal rights, as he did in this whole nullification crisis. One of the things that he said he wished he had done in his life, well, one was that he should have hanged John C. Calhoun. The other thing was he should have shot Henry Clay. So these guys are rivals. This is all happening here. You're going to soon see Calhoun and Clay kind of fade from American politics. But Jackson's ideas about politics are going to stick around for a long, long time. What have I forgotten about Jackson? There's just so much. The Indian Removal Act. The Trail of Tears. He's there for the Indian Removal Act, where he said, hey, the Cherokee have to leave that land in Georgia. And the other so-called civilized tribes, which felt they had done everything that they were supposed to do. And they had become like us. They had assimilated. They spoke English. They had Christianized. They had their, they had beliefs in a republic and everything that we did. And yet they still felt that they were sold out. That's going to lead you to Chief Justice Marshall, who's still in the picture. He is going to rule that the Cherokee do not have to vacate their land, that what Jackson has done and what Congress has done is unconstitutional. Jackson basically says, Mr. Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, which means I'm not going to do my job as president, which probably should get him impeached, but you don't impeach popular presidents. And Andrew Jackson is a popular president. You have the whole bank fight where he goes at it and he wants to kill that bank. He has personal issues with the bank. He had lost money as a younger man, and he also believes that the bank is unconstitutional. So he gets into it with, again, Henry Clay. Henry Clay brings the charter of the bank up for renewal earlier than it should have been. He and Nicholas Biddle, the guy who's in charge of the bank, they're working in collusion here. Jackson kills the bank by taking out all federal deposits and putting those deposits in so-called pet banks, which are Democratic banks in the states that are loyal to Jackson. So the bank dies. He also brings about an economic crisis, saying that the federal government will only accept specie, which is gold and silver. Well, how many people had gold and silver? So therefore the economy crashes. But you know what? He's not going to be the guy to deal with it. It's going to be poor old Martin Van Buren, his VP, who gets elected as president, who has to deal with the banking crisis.
And remember that Jackson is kind of the epitome of this major theme in this time period of expansion of democracy. You know, there's logistical expansion of democracy with, you know, universal white male suffrage, but there's also, like we've talked about, this undercurrent of the Second Great Awakening, the transcendentalist movement, abolitionist movement, temperance movement, all of these movements for reform of society. These are all examples of expansion of democracy, right? Where people are demanding changes. And these are people from all different walks of life. And so all of these different movements happening in this time period they're all feeding off of each other, right? So you've got Garrison's writings, you've got Frederick Douglass, you've got, you know, women that are starting to plan for Seneca Falls, talking about women's rights. They're dealing with temperance, trying to kind of use that as a platform. So we've got lots and lots of William Lloyd Garrison. That's who I was trying to think of. Then Liberator, but we have lots and lots of examples in this time period of reform. And reform is a form of democracy. And so a greater democratization of society in this time period. And Jackson is the epitome of that, being, you know, the kind of guy he is and being elected as he is and coming from the background that he is not like the rest. He is the first president that is not going to be like the rest. And he's going to get rid of so much of his cabinet. But Van Buren's going to be one that's going to hang around and is going to stick by him. And Mr. Bordas, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't he the first president that's born in the actual United States?
He is. All the other presidents were born in a colony that was part of the United States. He was born after the United States was created.
Right. And he spoke Dutch. That was his original language. He is. And so he is going to be a governor from New York. So just to kind of give you an idea about the background that he's coming from, he was Secretary of State. He's going to be a vice president to Jackson. So we have a lot of political experience coming out of coming with Van Buren as he gets in and, you know, begins what is started by Jackson as the Democratic Party. And he has to deal with the Panic of 1837. And he is, you know, having to see out a lot of the policies that Jackson initiated. And as you can see, he dies in office in his second term. And that's how Harrison becomes president here. But you can see how, you know, his presidency is kind of riddled by the shadow of Jackson. But I mean, what other notable pieces should they have in their back pocket about Van Buren? I think that's pretty much it, right?
When Van Buren runs for president the second time, he does lose to William Henry Harrison, and kind of interesting in that, you know, Van Buren.
I'm thinking about Harrison dying in office.
Now. Yeah, but Van Buren and Jackson are very different guys. I mean, you know, Jackson is this guy from the South who, you know, takes over in Tennessee. He becomes more of a Westerner. But, you know, Van Buren is this guy from Dutch heritage. He's from, you know, New York. There's not a lot in common here, but Mrs. Hall's right. He does support Jackson in many of the things. So when he runs against Harrison in that election, and Harrison's going to beat him, Harrison presents himself as the common man. He is not the common man.
Right.
Okay, he's a pretty wealthy guy.
Van Buren is much more of a common man.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this whole, you know, concept of who's really who, that kind of is not true. As Mrs. Hall said, under Harrison, I mean, how much can you do when you're president for 29, 30 days? Yeah. So then you go into the president who followed him, who was Tyler. And unfortunately for Tyler, he's going to be known as his accidency.
Right.
Meaning this guy should have never been president. But the only reason he became president is because the other guy was too stupid to get out of the rain, caught pneumonia, and died. And he gave a 2-hour speech too, which I would never want to do that. Speaking of 2 hours, Mrs. Hall, we are right up on 2 hours here.
Yeah, and we just have, well, if you want to cover Tyler real quick, then that leads us really, we pick up with Polk in the next time period anyway.
Yeah, so, I mean, real quick on Tyler, the stuff you should know is he's pushing for the annexation of Texas. This whole issue of Texas is being fought over by Northerners versus Southerners. The question is, if Texas is added, hey, that gives us another slave state. That could throw the whole Missouri Compromise out of whack. We're going to have to add another free state. Plus Texas, look at the size of Texas. Look how many people who could potentially live in Texas. Texas today has more electoral votes than every state beside the state of California. So the possibilities of Texas are huge here.
And it's right along the southern line where we can expand cotton production.
Oh, yeah, and it's also buttoned up against Mexico. And that's going to lead to problems with Mexico. So you get, speaking of new inventions, you get this telegraph invented by Samuel Morse. So that's going to increase communication. Remember that Abraham Lincoln used this telegraph system very effectively during the Civil War. You had the Irish potato famine. You had the Know Nothing Party, which was a short-lived party, but was a party that if anybody ever asked you, hey, what can you tell me about what goes on in a Know Nothing Party? I don't know anything. I can't tell you. That Know Nothing Party will eventually fade away. People from that Know Nothing Party will eventually join, like the Republican Party. And probably the biggest thing that might have happened under him, beside the whole Texas issue, was this Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which kind of works out some more differences that exist between the United States and Britain. So we in Britain are starting to come a little bit closer together in our beliefs. We know today that Britain and the United States are very close allies, but this is where that stuff starts to change as a result of this. I'm trying to think of the other treaty, Mrs. Hall. Why isn't it not coming to mind? Where we demilitarized the our border with Canada. That was a little bit earlier, but each one of these is a step to better relations between the United States and Britain. So this is about the Oregon Territory, and Oregon's going to come up again here in the not too distant future.
Oh, we didn't even say Manifest Destiny.
There, yes, you did. You just said it, Manifest Destiny. All right, so how about if we pick it up there next time?
Yeah, just, I mean, the idea that we're expanding, we're God-given right to do so. This is the famous painting of the woman, you know, expanding into the territory with the telegraph line and all this other stuff. But again, this is just another theme of this time period is, you know, land expansion. And now, you know, with every piece of land that we take, we question what we do with it. You know, it solves one problem and it creates 50 others. So, and that's pretty much where we're going to pick up next week. And so this week you are actually reviewing units 5 and 6. So Civil War, lead up to the Civil War itself, Reconstruction, and then the Gilded Age. And then we will bring all of that together next week for our next big review session. So it looks like we're only left with a handful of people. It looks like most people bailed on us early. But if you have any questions between now and next week, don't forget to post them or let us know, and we can address those. And we'll just meet back here again next week and talk about everything else. Sound good?
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Hall.
You're so welcome. Have a great day, guys. I hope you catch the recording of Lin-Manuel and his master class for that's posted on the YouTube page.
Okay, so we can go back and watch that, Ms. Hall?
Yes, it's been recorded.
Okay, great. I want to see that.
Yep.
All right. Hey, I gotta get to another meeting.
All right.
Thank you.
See you later, everybody.
Yeah.